Okay, so my topic for today is the impacts of unconditional cash transfers on schooling. And I'll be looking at both schooling in adolescence and young adulthood, and I'll be looking specifically at the child support grant in South Africa. So by way of some background, this graph is based on data from a paper by Branson, Hoffmeyer, and Lamb from 2014, just showing schooling transitions between 2008 and 2010, so between two waves of the NIDS data set. And it shows you pretty clearly that dropout rates increase and progression rates decrease at higher grades. So in South Africa, schooling is compulsory until grade 9 or age 14, as many of you probably know. We can see here that as we move out of those compulsory schooling years, there's an increase in dropout rates and a decrease in the number of people passing and progressing through to the next grade. So this paper is really focused on looking at the effect of the child support grant on schooling outcomes in these years where dropout rates are particularly high. So really focusing on those adolescent years post age 14. So when we think about improving education outcomes, we typically think there are supply side and demand side interventions, and cash transfers fall within demand side interventions. So just to talk briefly through some of the demand side interventions that are available to improve education outcomes. The first type tends to fall under what we call information-based. So this is providing information about things like returns to schooling, providing counseling and career counseling to students. There's information that improves education outcomes. Merit-based scholarships, so actually providing rewards to individuals for acquiring human capital.
Sorry,
do you mind turning your mic off? Thank you. Okay. Okay, so merit-based scholarships are providing explicit reward, so directly tying a financial reward to acquiring human capital. And there's evidence that merit-based scholarships also lead to increased education. And then cash transfers are one of the big policies used to target education outcomes. And these tend to be both conditional and unconditional. When it comes to conditional transfers, those are typically found through Latin America, and there's a lot of evidence around conditional cash transfers. Particular Progressa, which is arguably the most widely studied conditional cash transfer. Lots of evidence that directly improved education outcomes, and Progressa was directly tied to education outcomes. There are also unconditional cash transfers, which are typically found throughout African countries. There's comparatively less evidence on the effects of unconditional cash transfers, and that's the type of cash transfer I'll be studying today. There are other types of interventions that have been studied as well that have been shown to have positive effects on education outcomes. This includes providing literacy classes to mothers, female sanitary products, and providing bicycles for girls to actually attend secondary school. So talking a little bit more about cash transfers, I already said some of this, but there's a lot of information that a lot of evidence that conditional cash transfers generally increase enrollment and attainment. Much of this evidence comes from Latin America, where conditional cash transfers tend to be quite prevalent. Unconditional cash transfers, on the other hand, are more prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, and there is relatively little evidence on unconditional cash transfers as opposed to the conditional type of transfers that are found in Latin America. A policy related to cash transfers, it's not obviously the provision of cash transfer, but it works by reducing the price of schooling. So there was a school fee elimination policy in South Africa, and this was actually found to have no significant impact on enrollment at primary school or secondary school. And that's an earlier paper by Bochum. So it suggests that changing the price of schooling might not actually have a big effect in South Africa. And so theoretically, the difference between conditional and unconditional cash transfers has to do with these changes in incentives. So both conditional and unconditional cash transfers have an income effect because they're providing additional income to the household or the child. But conditional cash transfers have this additional substitution effect because they are changing the relative price of schooling. And so theoretically, you might expect that conditional cash transfers have a larger effect, but the empirical evidence on that is actually mixed. So there are some studies that suggest that it might be true that conditional cash transfers have a larger effect than unconditional cash transfers. There are other studies that suggest that, for example, there is no difference between a conditional cash transfer and a transfer that is essentially labeled. So it doesn't have any formal conditions, but it's labeled as being something that should be spent on education. So in this paper, I examined the effect of South Africa's child support grant on enrollment and attainment. This is a very large program, both by international standards and also to the individual households that are actually receiving this income. So it is the largest unconditional cash transfer in Africa, and the fourth largest in the developing world as a whole. And this is both in terms of the number of individuals that are covered, as well as a proportion of the population that is covered. So it's quite large relative to the other other cash transfer programs that we see. It also represents significant cash transfer to households that are receiving that income. So it's about 40% of median monthly per capita income. I'm going to study the effects on education outcomes during adolescence. So schooling in South Africa is compulsory until age 14 or grade 9, whichever comes first. And after that, dropout rates are high and progression rates are low, as I showed you in that first slide. So this paper is really focused on looking at education outcomes during that time period where dropout rates are particularly high and failure rates are particularly high as well. I'm also going to study the longer term effects during young adulthood. So looking at the time beyond when individuals are still eligible for the grant. So post age 18, when they're not actually receiving the grant, but are still, I'm going to study to see if there are any effects that can be observed post CSG eligibility. To the best of my knowledge, these longer term effects of the child support grant have not previously been estimated. My basic approach is to use a difference in difference strategy. So I'm going to compare younger cohorts who were eligible for the grant during their adolescence with older cohorts who were not eligible during that same time. As a preview of the findings, I find that adolescent CSG eligibility increases attainment during adolescence and young adulthood, and also increases, enrollment and attainment during young adulthood as well. The effects on attainment are concentrated among females, rural individuals, and those with the lowest baseline numerical literacy. So there's evidence that suggests other effects are also among populations that we might consider to be the most vulnerable to dropping out. So some brief background on the child support grant. It is a means-tested grant, so it's only available to low-income households. There are no additional conditions tied to the grant, at least over the sample period that I'm talking about. The grant was originally available to children under the age of 7 when it was first introduced in 1998, but there have been progressive extensions to the age threshold over time. And these include that in 2005, the age limit was increased to 14. And then in January 2009, the grant was extended to all those under the age of 15. And at the same time, a phased extension that would provide the grant to all those under the age of 18 was announced. So this progressive extension, and then in the next year, in 2010, would be increased to the eligibility would be increased to those under age 16, 2011 to those under age 17, and in 2012 to those under age 18. So the focus of this paper is that phased extension that happened over the period 2009 and 2012. These changes in the age eligibility threshold did not mean that new cohorts became eligible for the grant that previously were not. Rather, it meant that cohorts that were already eligible now have their eligibility extended. So I'm really studying not new eligibility for the child support grant, but continuing eligibility during these adolescent years and what that might mean for education outcomes contemporaneously as well as in the longer term. So this little table basically shows the cross-cohort variation in grant eligibility that I'm exploiting. So I focus on 4 cohorts in my analysis, the 92 through to the 95 cohorts. The 92 and 93 cohorts are the cohorts that I will call the older cohorts. And these are the cohorts that did not experience eligibility for the grant during adolescence. And then I have my younger cohorts, 94 and 95. They did experience grant eligibility during their adolescence. And you can see that in this table where I assume that someone basically shares my birthday, so that they're born on the 31st of December, meaning that they were eligible for that entire calendar year. And we can see that the younger cohorts, the 92, 93 cohorts, were eligible for the grant basically up until age 13. Then they lose eligibility once they age out of that eligibility threshold that is set at 14. Whereas the 94 and 95 cohorts, also eligible through to age 13, but because they fall just under these age thresholds for the child support grant, as they're being extended over those years, they retain eligibility during their adolescence and over that time period. And so it's this difference in eligibility across the adolescent years that I am exploiting in the difference in difference strategy. So the younger cohorts, born in 94 to 95, are eligible for the child support grant during their adolescence. And I'm defining that as the years between the ages of 14 and 17. The older cohorts, born in 92 and 93, were not, as we saw in that previous table. They're always just above those cutoffs as the grant is being extended over 2009 to 2012. And both cohorts were eligible when they were 12 and 13 years old. So the treatment that I'm studying is this continuing eligibility through adolescence versus losing your eligibility during adolescence. This graph basically shows the difference in these cohorts in terms of actually receiving the child support grant. So the red dotted line is the oldest cohorts, the 92 to 93 cohorts. And you can see basically there is some non-zero risk take-up, although technically they're not really eligible, but it is much, much lower than the take-up for the youngest cohorts, 94 to 95. When we see take-up rates between 40 and 60% during their adolescence. And it is this difference that I am exploiting. I should also note, you can't see it here, but the oldest cohorts were eligible for the grant when they were 12 and 13 years old. I just don't observe them in the data, so that's why the graph for them only starts at 14. So the data that I use to construct that loss graph and I use for the main analysis comes from NIDS, National Income Dynamic Study. I use all available waves, so waves 1 to 5, which means that I'm covering the time period 2008 through to 2017, which aligns very nicely with these policy changes. So 2008 is kind of the baseline. Over 2009 to 2012, the age threshold of the child support grant was raised in yearly increments from 14 to 18. So NIDS nicely overlaps with these policy changes that I'm trying to study. I will restrict the analysis to Africans and coloreds born between 1992 to 1995, whose caregivers are income eligible for the child support grant. Another nice feature of NIDS is that in wave 1, individuals are also asked about education outcomes in 2007. So I have data on pre-adolescent outcomes for the older cohorts. So even though in 2008 they were already 14 years old, because I have information on them in 2007, I have information on their education outcomes before their adolescent years. The estimating equation that I use is a basic difference in difference with fixed effects. So the alpha here is the individual fixed effect. The treatment effect during adolescence is this during CSG variable. that is equal to 1 for the younger cohorts during their observed adolescent years, so during the years from 14 to 17. This during CSG is obviously 0 for the control cohorts throughout the entire period. After CSG is trying to measure this effect during young adulthood, so that's equal to 1 for the younger cohorts when they're over 18, and again, it is always 0 for the control cohorts. Delta T controls flexibly for any time effects. The lambda A are age fixed effects, and that allows me to ensure that all comparisons are happening within age group rather than across it. So for example, 20-year-olds who were treated, as the youngest cohorts, are compared with 20-year-olds who are not treated, the older cohorts. The treatment indicator is subsumed by the individual fixed effect. And the X matrix contains a variety of household and individual controls, including household size, the number of other children eligible for the child support grants in the household, the number of males and females eligible for the old age grants in the household, and indicators for province of residence and urban location. I include in particular, the number of males and females eligible for the old age grant in the household, because also during the time period that I'm studying, there was a significant change in the age eligibility for the old age grant. So bringing into alignment the age eligibility thresholds for males and females, and that happened over the same time period that I'm talking about. It was also obviously targeted at low-income households. And so I include those just essentially to partly validate the difference in difference strategy. If I include these variables, the treatment effects coming out of the difference in difference should not change very much if these were valid treatment and control groups, if they're not differentially affected by this big policy change on the old age group. So this is some summary statistics. Initial survey wave in 2008. The youngest cohorts are my treatment cohorts. The oldest cohorts are the control cohorts. And the final 2 columns is showing the difference in means and standard error of that difference. So it's obvious that at baseline, 2008, the youngest cohorts have significantly fewer years of education on the range of about 2 years. That's exactly what you would expect. They're 2 years younger. You can see that looking further down the table at age and years, the youngest cohorts are significantly 2 years younger, and that's statistically significant. So that years of completed education is obviously just picking up the differences in ages, and this highlights again the need for those age fixed effects in the specification to ensure that comparisons are happening within age group and not across them. There's also a slightly significant difference in the number of pension eligible females. So there are slightly more pension eligible females in the youngest cohort households than the oldest cohort households, although the actual difference is not that large, and that is statistically significant. It does seem that for whatever reason, amongst the youngest cohorts tend to have fewer females than the oldest cohorts. I don't really have a good reason for that, but that is what is in the data. Other than that, there really are no statistically significant differences between these cohorts at baseline at the beginning. There is no significant difference in wage income, no significant difference in the number of other CSG eligible children that they're living with. Household size is similar. Urban location, so they're an urban rural house, that is also similar, and no statistically significant difference in terms of the racial composition of the youngest and oldest cohorts. So let's basically jump straight into the main results of the paper. So columns 1 and 2 show the results for the enrollment indicator. So the 2 education outcomes that I'm studying here, sorry, I didn't actually specifically say this earlier, is enrollment, so whether someone is enrolled in school or not. And then the second outcome is years of completed education. So I'm studying attainment, how many years of education has an individual completed. During CSG, captures that contemporaneous effect of child support grant eligibility. So looking at the years during adolescence, during the ages 14 to 17. And then after CSG, captures the longer term effects of child support grant eligibility. So looking at the effects after or at age 18 onwards, and this is a time when individuals are actually no longer eligible for the child support grant, but we're interested to see whether there is long-term effects of having been eligible for the grant during adolescence. The columns 1 and 3 don't have any household control, so it's just the straight difference and difference with fixed effects without anything in that X matrix. And columns 2 and 4 do include those household controls, which if you remember are things like urban or rural, household size. In particular, the thing that I was flagging was the number of pension eligible individuals separately, male and female. And the first thing to notice here is that the coefficients are very stable, whether I include household controls or not. In particular, whether I include the number of pension eligible males and females in the household. So this suggests that this is kind of the first piece of evidence that the treatment and control groups are well constructed, including these additional control variables does not actually affect the estimates. So turning to the results, on the enrollment outcome, there's actually no statistically significant effect on enrollment during CSG. So we don't see an effect on enrollment during the time when individuals are eligible for the grant, but there is the significant effect after. So post the eligibility time period, post age 18, we do see that actually the youngest cohorts, those cohorts that were eligible for the grant during their adolescence, have a higher enrollment rate. And this might be due to the fact that even though there's no significant effect on enrollment during adolescence, there is a significant effect on the years of completed education. So the treated cohorts, the youngest cohorts who experience adolescent CSG child support grant eligibility, have about a third of a year more of schooling during their adolescence. And this gap widens to almost half a year when we look during young adulthood after CSG eligibility. This T statistic that I have here is basically a T statistic to see whether during CSG and after CSG, whether those effects are equal to each other, tested against the one-sided alternative that the after CSG effect is greater than the during CSG effect. And the T statistic is particularly relevant, and I do this really entirely because of the years completed outcome, which is a stock variable. So that the gap in years education after CSG should be at least equal to the gap that is accumulated during CSG eligibility. And so that T statistic is basically testing to see, well, is there an additional effect after CSG eligibility during adolescence over and above any effect that we might be seeing actually during eligibility. And that T statistic is significant for the years completed outcome. And so we can see that there is an additional effect on the years of completed education. So the gap does actually widen after CSG eligibility has expired. I should have said this earlier, but all these effects are intent to treat estimates. So the during CSG and after CSG coefficients that I show there are intention to treat estimates, because I'm not actually exploiting take up of the grant. I'm just looking at who is eligible for the grant in terms of income and age qualifications. And I do this to avoid any potential endogeneity issues around actual take up of the grant. I do provide an implied treatment on the treated. So those are the two rows just below the T statistic. So taking those intention to treat estimates and scaling them by the average take-up rate that I see for the youngest cohorts, that average take-up rate is around 38% during their adolescence. So scaling the ITT estimates gives me an implied treatment on the treated, and you can see the implied treatment on the treated is actually quite large. So In particular, the enrollment rate after a CSG eligibility is now much higher, and the years of completed education are much higher. So during CSG, there's about an eighth of a year. And if we go beyond CSG, we're looking at almost over a year. So that the effects, the treatment on the treated effects are actually quite large. So to summarize these findings and also put them in context with some other results that have come out of the literature. So we see that adolescent CSG eligibility increases longer-term enrollment in young adulthood by 12 percentage points. There's no effect on contemporaneous enrollment. This lack of contemporaneous enrollment effect might not be surprising given these results that Borkum has provided, saying that there's no effect of school fee elimination on enrollment. So taken together, these results seem to suggest that income or price effects are not a large barrier to enrollment during adolescence. However, this is different from earlier studies. So from a different time period, 2005 to 2006, for both grants, the child support grants and the old age grant, that do show increased contemporaneous enrollment in rural areas. So it might have to do with a different time period studied, the old age grant. For the child support grant, it was also looking at different ages. But at least my study, along with Borkum's study, which also studies a similar time period, seems to suggest that changing the price or increasing income might not affect contemporaneous enrollment for adolescents. The size of the enrollment effect in young adulthood, if I compare it to estimates from the literature, so as I said earlier, as far as I'm aware, this is the first estimate looking at enrollment in young adulthood, so there's no direct comparison for it, but I compared to the estimates that have been found for younger CSG recipients and also effects on enrollments of the old age grant, again for younger individuals. And the size of that enrollment effect that I see in young adulthood is larger than that has been observed for younger child support grant recipients. And it is comparable to the effects of the old age grant that have been observed. And then adolescent child support grant eligibility increases contemporaneous and long-term education attainment by 0.3 to 0.5 years. And that's the intention to treat effect. The treatment on the treated effect is much larger, in the order of 0.8 to 1.2 years. But these ITT effects are larger than that estimated for 10-year-old child support grant recipients. So suggesting that the timing of the intervention might matter. So as I said, the timing of this intervention is during adolescence, so individuals might be at greatest risk for grade repetition. So an intervention during adolescence seems to have larger effects than an intervention earlier on, at least when we're looking at educational attainment on the years of education accumulated. The effects are similar to that estimated for the old age grant in an earlier paper. This is even though the value of the old age grant is around 4 times that of the child support grant. The estimates are quite similar actually to the estimates that come out of Mexico's conditional progressive program. So even though this is an unconditional grant and the Mexican program is a conditional program, the estimates that I'm finding are actually quite similar to those found for the Mexican program for individuals and adolescents, so around the same age. I look at differential effects as well, based on previous research that has suggested differential effects of grants in South Africa, depending on the gender of the recipient and also depending on the location of the recipient, whether it's rural or urban. I also add in some differential effects based on individual score on a numeracy test. So wave 1 of NIDS had this numeracy test. So that's the final 4 columns in this table, num-Q1. So I take the individual score on a numeracy test, split that into 4 different quartiles and group individuals based on their performance on this numeracy test. And this table just summarizes basically where I see these large differential effects. So looking at the enrollment margin, it seems that that Increased enrollment during young adulthood seems to be driven by male individuals, by those in rural areas, those in the lowest quartile of numeracy skills, as well as the third quartile, somewhat interestingly. Then if I look at the years of education, the outcomes seem really to be driven by females. Again, those in rural areas and those in the first quartile of the numeracy score, as well as the third quartile. Kind of the strong pattern that emerges here is really that there is a strong effect amongst rural individuals, and really that's driving the effects, and that's where the largest effects are found, and also those in the first quartile of the numeracy scores, so those with the lowest numeracy scores. So there is some evidence here that the effects of the grant are particularly large amongst those who we might think are more vulnerable to decreased progression through the education system. I then turn to ask this question of, well, do these improved education outcomes actually translate into increased learning? So we've seen increases in enrollment during young adulthood and increases in years of education during adolescence and young adulthood. Ideally, that numeracy questionnaire that I talked about on the last slide would have been repeated in notes, but unfortunately it was not. So I instead rely on a single numeracy question. So I will upfront say that these results are obviously very suggestive and not definite. I rely on a numeracy question that was asked as part of 4 financial literacy questions in wave 5. I don't use the other 3 questions because they seem to be testing more really directly financial literacy, and so might reflect something other than schooling, perhaps like familiarity with the banking system, for example. So I focus on just this one question that is the most directly related to numeracy, or the most directly related to something that you would have learned in school. And that question is, suppose you need to borrow 100 Rand, which is the lower amount to pay back, 105 or 100 plus 3%. I look here at the difference in wave 5 just between the younger and older cohorts. So this is just a straight difference. It's not a difference in difference. So again, I'm looking at really just one question and just looking at the difference between the treated and control cohorts at one point in time. So it's obviously not a perfect measure, but it is suggestive given the earlier results to say, well, did this actually increase learning? And my results show that the younger cohorts are 9% more likely to answer this numeracy question correctly, but that effect is not statistically significant. I also look at the difference in answering this question correctly across males and females, urban, rural, and again, that baseline numeracy skill. And the one significant result is actually, again, amongst these rural cohorts. So the younger rural cohorts are 14% more likely to get the answer right, and the effect is statistically significant. So again, confirming this idea that the larger effects seem to be among rural individuals. And this is similar to what has been found before for the child support grant and the old age grant. I try to look at mechanisms as well, and it has this great data on education spending at the individual level in 5 specific categories: fees, uniforms, books, transport, other. So I estimate the main difference in difference with fixed effects equation, so my main estimating equation, and I now look at these education spending categories as the dependent variables to try to understand, basically, is education spending actually changing, and is that why we see the results that we do? So these are the results. The 5 categories of spending are the different rows. The column 1 is that coefficient from during CSG. So the effect during adolescence while individuals are eligible for the grant. And after CSG is basically saying, well, is there any effect in young adulthood where individuals are not actually still receiving the grant, but do we still see changes in education spending? So looking at column 1, even though only one coefficient is statistically significant, most of them are positive. So it does suggest that there is an increase in education spending on fees, on books, on other types of spending, and there is an increase in transport spending, and that is statistically significant at the 10% level. So there is evidence here that that child support grant income during adolescence is channeled towards education spending for individuals during their time of eligibility. The after CSG coefficients, on the other hand, are not really significant. Not significant at all, and actually tend to be negative. But this is, again, looking at a time when individuals actually don't have any additional child support grant income. And then basically just testing the identification assumptions. So I do two types of tests. The first is to explicitly test the parallel trends assumption. I do that using a different data set. So I use the labor force survey data as it's been assembled in PALMS, the post-apartheid labor market series. I look at from 2000 to 2007, when these cohorts are 8 to 12 years old. So I'm looking at the 92 to 95 cohorts, basically at an earlier time period. During this time, there was no difference in their eligibility, really. And I find that there is no evidence of significant differences in enrollment in years of education in their years pre-adolescence. So this confirms that parallel trends assumption that is required for the difference in difference is actually valid. I also do some placebo regression. So going back to the NIDS data, I now let the cohorts that were my control cohorts in the main estimation, the 92 and 93 cohorts, I let them be the treatment cohorts. And I consider the 1990 and 1991 cohorts as the control cohorts. Obviously, there's no difference in adolescent CSG eligibility between these cohorts. None of them were eligible for the grant during their adolescence. And I find that there is no treatment effect, indeed, in adolescence or young adulthood between these two cohorts. So both of these identification tests confirm that I think that the treatment and control cohort and the difference in different design is a valid one. So just to conclude, I find that adolescent CSG eligibility increases contemporaneous and longer term education attainment, and it increases enrollment in young adulthood. The effects on attainment are really concentrated among those who might be most vulnerable to poor progression rates, the females, rural individuals, and those in the lowest quartile of baseline numeracy. Improvements in education outcomes are larger than those estimated for younger child support grant recipients. This suggests that the timing of the intervention might matter. So really being able to time an intervention during adolescence, where in South Africa is where we see really dropout rates start to increase significantly and progression rates start to slow significantly. So timing that intervention for those adolescent years seems to have a larger effect than those than interventions at younger ages. The intervention is also actually similar to those estimated for the old age grant. And this suggests that the targeting of the intervention might potentially matter. So the old age grant, even though there's lots of evidence that tells us that this grant is used to improve outcomes among children, the value of that grant is much larger. So it's 4 times that of the child support grant, whereas targeting a child support grant to a particular child does seem to improve education outcomes for that child, even with a lower value of the grant. The estimated effects that I find are actually quite similar to those found for Mexico's conditional progressive program. And I think that this provides support for unconditional cash transfer programs. So, and because there is some evidence that the grant is actually transferred toward education spending for the intended beneficiary, even though the grant is obviously not conditional on education outcomes, nor is it a labeled transfer spending. So it's not even labeled as being required for education transfer, but households do seem to be channeling it towards education spending. And so this provides, I think, support for unconditional cash transfer programs, showing that they can have estimated effects similar to a conditional program, where receipt is conditional on education, as it is in Mexico's progressive program. and also comes without the additional administrative burden of having to implement. So just some extensions and future work that I hope to do. I would love to actually explore further this idea on actual education achievement on learning. So here I looked at just one question and a difference at one point in time. But it would be good to do, I think, more causal work, looking at, for example, test scores or other measures of actual learning. And then to look at the effects on long-term employment and earnings. So I see this increased enrollment during young adulthood that comes from adolescent CSG eligibility. And that could show up as decreased labor force participation for these cohorts during those years. But it could increase employment and earnings in later life because these individuals will have higher levels of human capital when they do enter the labor force. So it might delay labor force entry, but it might lead to better outcomes in terms of employment and earnings when these cohorts do actually enter the labor force. So that's the end of my presentation. I will take questions now.